Hey everyone, before we dive into a story that will absolutely grip you and refuse to let go, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss the deep dive true crime content we're bringing you. Today's episode is not just another missing persons case. It's a story that spans a decade and a half of agonizing silence, a discovery that came from the most unlikely place, and a final confrontation that will leave you breathless. In 1984, in Austin, Texas, a young girl and her father vanished during a simple weekend road trip. For 16 years, the mother lived in a purgatory of grief and unanswered questions. Then, an alert from a local TV station and a discovery in a dusty junkyard shattered everything. What was found in that junkyard? A crushed, rusted car, a blue handbag, and a trail that led to a nightmare no one could have imagined. But the biggest shock was still waiting inside a remote farmhouse, where a secret had been hidden for 16 long years. This is the story of how a mother's love outlasted hope and found the impossible. It was a crisp autumn morning in Austin, Texas. Sunlight was filtering through the windows of Margaret Holbrook's living room, the kind of peaceful light that normally signals a quiet weekend. But there was no peace inside that house. Margaret sat on her floral print sofa, clutching the television remote as though it were a lifeline. Beside her was her mother, Doris, whose face carried the weight of shared grief and the same tense anticipation that had become a cruel annual ritual. "It's almost time," Margaret whispered, her voice thin and barely audible as she turned up the volume. For 16 years, Margaret had done the same thing. She paid local news stations to broadcast a missing persons alert on this exact date, the anniversary of the day her world had been torn apart. The screen flickered, and then the commercial segment began. Margaret leaned forward, her heart slamming against her ribs. There they were, a family photograph. A handsome man with a thick mustache and kind eyes stood proudly next to a small girl with a bright, gap-toothed smile. Beside the photo was an image of a gleaming red Cadillac. 16 years ago today, Jim Holbrook and his 8-year-old daughter, Lucia, disappeared during a weekend road trip, the announcer's voice stated. They were last seen driving a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille, license plate THB 143. If you have any information regarding their whereabouts, please contact the Austin Police Department. Margaret clicked the television off, unable to bear the silence that followed. She couldn't let another year pass without answers. Doris squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'll go upstairs to freshen up," she said, her voice soft, before disappearing up the stairs. Left alone, Margaret's eyes drifted to a bookshelf along the far wall. Her fingers trailed across the spines until they stopped at a worn, leather-bound photo album. She pulled it down and returned to the sofa, opening it with the careful reverence of a sacred text. Page after page revealed moments frozen in amber. Jim standing proudly next to that Cadillac he had worked so hard to afford. Lucia beaming on her first day of school. The three of them at Barton Springs, their faces radiant with joy. Margaret traced the outline of her daughter's face with a trembling finger. "Where are you?" she whispered to the photograph, a question she had asked 1,000 times before. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the heavy silence. Margaret set the album aside and crossed to the kitchen. "Hello?" she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Mrs. Holbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department. We've just received a report of potential evidence found at a junkyard in San Marcos. We believe it could be related to your husband and daughter's case," the officer said. Margaret's free hand clutched the counter for support. "What kind of evidence?" "We'd prefer not to discuss details over the phone, ma'am. Would you be available to come identify what's been found? We can have a patrol car pick you up in about 10 minutes. "Yes," Margaret replied immediately, her heart pounding. "Yes, I'll be ready." She hung up the phone and hurried to the bottom of the stairs. "Mom, the police just called. They found something at a junkyard in San Marcos. They think it might be connected to Jim and Lucia." Doris appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "What did they find?" "They wouldn't say, but they're sending a car to pick us up in 10 minutes. Doris descended quickly, her earlier weariness vanished. "I'm coming with you." They waited in tense silence until the patrol car arrived. The officer offered little conversation during the hour-long drive south to San Marcos. Margaret watched the familiar Texas landscape pass by in a blur, her thoughts racing through every possibility. Beside her, Doris clutched her purse in her lap, her knuckles white. When they finally arrived at Holbrook's auto salvage, Margaret's stomach twisted painfully. Police vehicles and yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a section of the junkyard. An officer led them through the maze of junked cars toward a cluster of people gathered around something Margaret couldn't yet see. A tall man in plain clothes turned to greet them. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett?"
I'm Detective Reyes.
"Thank you for coming so quickly. What did you find?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Detective Reyes stepped aside, and there it was, crushed almost beyond recognition, but still unmistakable. A red Cadillac DeVille. The once gleaming paint was now dull and rusted in places. But there was no doubt in Margaret's mind. This was Jim's car, the one he had saved for years to buy, the one he had loved, the one he and Lucia had driven away in 16 years ago. "Oh my God," Doris whispered beside her, gripping Margaret's arm for support. Margaret approached the vehicle as if in a trance. The car had been partially crushed, presumably by a large excavator parked nearby. Police officers were photographing every angle. "We can't check the interior because of the condition," Detective Reyes explained gently. "But we need to confirm. Is this your husband's car, Mrs. Holbrook?" Margaret circled the vehicle, her eyes scanning every dent and scratch. Finally, she stopped at what remained of the right rear wheel. She pointed to a small dent in the chrome wheel cover. "Jim hit a curb the week before they disappeared," she said, her voice distant. "We were going to get it fixed, but—" She trailed off, then looked up at the detective, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. "Yes, this is their car." Detective Reyes nodded solemnly, then gestured to a man standing nervously at the edge of the crime scene. "This is Dean Holbrook, the owner of the junkyard. He's the one who called us." Dean stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I had no idea about the car's history, I swear. It was scheduled to be crushed this morning. I was in my office afterward and saw the missing person segment on TV. I recognized the car immediately and called the police." "Who brought it in?" Margaret demanded, ignoring his outstretched hand. Dean shifted uncomfortably. "That's just it, ma'am. I don't have any record of it being brought in. It's not in our system at all." "That sounds suspicious," Doris said sharply. Detective Reyes held up a hand. "Mr. Holbrook was the one who alerted us to the car's presence, Mrs. Barrett. We have no reason to believe he was involved in its appearance here." As he spoke, a woman in greasy overalls approached the group. "I saw Reed bring it in," she said. All eyes turned to her. "Reed?" Detective Reyes asked. "Reed Caraway?" Dean explained. "He's my partner. Runs the technical side of things. He's the head technician here." Detective Reyes immediately pulled out his phone. "We need to speak with him. Can you call him?" Dean nodded and pulled out his own phone. After several moments, he shook his head. "No answer." "I'll need his home address," Detective Reyes said firmly. Dean scribbled an address on a piece of paper. "He lives in South Austin. Here's his information." Detective Reyes took the paper and turned to one of his officers. "I want a unit sent to this address immediately. Have them bring Mr. Caraway in for questioning." He turned back to Dean. "Is there anything else of Mr. Caraway's on the premises that might be relevant to our investigation?" "His office," Dean said. "But it's locked, and only Reed has the key. We'll need a warrant to search it properly," Detective Reyes said, turning to another officer. "Get that in motion." Margaret stood silently through this exchange, her eyes never leaving the crushed red Cadillac. 16 years of wondering, of hoping against hope. And now this. The car that had carried her husband and daughter away from her for the last time was here, crushed beyond recognition. But there was no sign of Jim or Lucia. "Let's search the area," Detective Reyes instructed his team. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, if you feel up to it, your help in identifying any potential personal items would be invaluable." Margaret nodded mutely, and she and Doris followed the officers as they began to methodically search the junkyard. Hours passed as they examined piles of scrap metal and discarded items. Nothing related to Jim or Lucia surfaced. Eventually, they found themselves outside Reed Caraway's locked office, waiting for a warrant. The afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky. The sun reached its peak when two police cruisers pulled into the junkyard. Margaret and Doris straightened as they saw a third vehicle, a dark blue pickup truck, following behind. The truck parked a short distance away, and a man in his mid-20s climbed out. He had short brown hair and wore work clothes with the Junkyard's logo on the breast pocket. Detective Reyes approached him immediately. "Mr. Carraway?" The man nodded, a look of confusion on his face. "Yes, that's me. What's going on?"
I'm Detective Reyes.
"We're investigating the appearance of a red Cadillac in your junkyard. One that's connected to a 16-year-old missing persons case." Reed's eyes widened slightly. "The car that was crushed this morning? I heard Dean called you guys about it." Detective Reyes nodded toward Margaret and Doris. "This is Margaret Holbrook and her mother, Doris Barrett. The Cadillac belonged to Mrs. Holbrook's husband, who disappeared with their daughter 16 years ago." Reed approached the women, his expression appropriately somber. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Reed Carraway." He offered his hand, which Margaret took after a moment's hesitation. "The car wasn't properly logged into your system," Detective Reyes continued. "One of your co-workers said she saw you bring it in. We'd like to know how it came into your possession." Reed ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Yeah, that was a weird situation. About a week ago, an older man brought it in when Dean wasn't around. He said he didn't have any use for the car anymore and wanted it destroyed." "Did he give you his name?" Detective Reyes asked. Reed shook his head. "No, and that's what was strange. He paid cash, a good amount, too. But when I tried to get his information for our records, he just ran off. Literally left the keys in the ignition and walked away. I called after him, tried to chase him, but he was gone." "Can you describe this man?" Detective Reyes pressed. Reed furrowed his brow in concentration. "Tall, maybe 6 feet, thin build, gray hair, though it looked like it might have been dark before. He had a mustache, a thick one, wore glasses, khaki pants, and a button-up shirt. Spoke real quiet, almost hard to hear him." Margaret's breath caught audibly. That sounds like Jim," she whispered to Doris, her face pale. "What?" Doris said too loudly. "But that's impossible." Detective Reyes turned to them. "Mrs. Holbrook, are you saying this description matches your husband?" Margaret nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "It could be. The height, the build, the mustache. Jim always wore button-ups, even on weekends." Detective Reyes looked back at Reed. "How old would you say this man was?" "Hard to tell," Reed replied. "Maybe 50s. Could have been younger, though. He looked tired, weathered, you know." Doris shook her head vigorously. "This doesn't make sense. Why would Jim get rid of the Cadillac? He loved that car. He worked so hard for it. And why now?" Margaret added, her voice stronger. "After 16 years? And where is Lucia?" Detective Reyes held up a calming hand. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We need to investigate further." He turned back to Reed. "We'd like to search your office, Mr. Carraway. One of your co-workers mentioned you keep it locked." Reed nodded. "Yeah, of course. Nothing to hide. It's just that we keep some valuable tools and parts catalogs in there. Follow me." As they walked toward the small building that housed the Junkyard's offices, Margaret and Doris exchanged troubled glances. "Do you really think it could have been Jim?" Doris whispered. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. Sounds like him. But why would he abandon the car after all this time? And where has he been? Where's Lucia?" When they reached the office building, Reed led them to a door at the end of a short hallway. He pulled out a ring of keys and unlocked it, stepping aside to let Detective Reyes enter first. "Please wait out here," Detective Reyes told Margaret and Doris. As the police entered the office, Doris suddenly clutched at her chest, her breathing becoming labored. "Mom," Margaret said, alarmed. "What's wrong?" "My asthma," Doris gasped, fumbling in her purse. "I think it's the stress. My inhaler." Margaret helped her mother use the inhaler, watching anxiously as Doris's breathing gradually steadied. "I'm okay," Doris insisted, though her face remained pale. "Just overwhelmed. I'm sorry for the trouble." After nearly an hour, Detective Reyes emerged from the office. "We've completed our search. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything directly connected to your husband or daughter." Margaret's shoulders slumped with disappointment. So, we're no closer to understanding what happened. We've made progress, Detective Reyes assured her. Finding the Cadillac is significant. Now, we need to figure out who brought it here and why. He turned to Reed. Mr. Carraway, we'd like you to come to the station to make a formal statement. Reed nodded. Of course, whatever I can do to help. Back at the police station, Margaret and Doris sat in a small conference room with Detective Reyes. Reed provided his statement, but his story aligned with what he had already told them. Without a warrant, there was little more they could do. Defeated, Margaret and Doris prepared to leave. In the lobby, Reed approached them again. I could give you a ride. I live in the Hyde Park area. Detective Reyes looked dubious. That's not necessary, Mr. Carraway. We can arrange a car. Before the detective could finish, a uniformed officer approached with an urgent message, drawing him away. Margaret assessed their situation. Her mother was exhausted, and they faced a longer wait for a police escort. We'd appreciate the ride, Margaret decided, ignoring the flicker of unease in her stomach. Reed's pickup was old but well-maintained. The afternoon in Austin was relatively quiet as they headed north. Reed maintained a casual conversation, asking about the neighborhood, commenting on changes to the city over the years. Suddenly, Doris gasped and began patting her pockets. What's wrong, Mom? Margaret asked, alarmed. My inhaler, Doris said, her voice tight. I think I left it at the Junkyard office when I had that attack earlier. Reed glanced over at them. I have asthma, too. If you need an inhaler, I have a spare at my place. We could swing by and pick it up. It's a prescription inhaler, Doris insisted. I don't want to waste money on another one when mine is probably sitting on a desk at the Junkyard. We could just go back and get it. I don't mind driving you back, Reed offered. Margaret looked at her mother's determined face and sighed. If you're sure, Mom? I am, Doris said. I don't want to waste a perfectly good inhaler. It's settled then, Reed said, signaling to turn around. Back to San Marcos we go. At the Junkyard, they made their way to the main office. Dean Holbrook was behind the counter, looking surprised to see them. Reed, Mrs. Holbrook, I thought you all left with the police hours ago. We did, Reed explained, but Mrs. Barrett believes she left her inhaler here during her asthma attack earlier. Dean's face softened. Oh, I see. Yes, actually I found it after everyone left. I put it in Reed's office for safekeeping, figuring he'd know how to get it back to you. Reed nodded, fishing his key ring from his pocket. As he opened the door and disappeared inside, Doris frowned, tilting her head as if something had caught her eye. A few minutes passed, and Margaret found herself growing restless. What's taking him so long? It's just an inhaler. Doris shifted in her seat, then suddenly straightened, grabbing Margaret's arm. Margaret, she whispered urgently. When Reed opens the door to come out, look at the top shelf of the glass cabinet across from the door. What? Why? Margaret asked, confused. I just caught a glimpse when he went in, Doris explained hurriedly, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. I think I saw a blue handbag up there between some books. It looks just like Lucia's. Margaret's heart skipped several beats. That's impossible, Mom. Lucia's bag was with her when she disappeared. Just look, Doris insisted. It's the exact same shade of blue. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of footsteps announced Reed's return. As the office door swung open, both women instinctively looked past him. Through the doorway, Margaret could see a glass-fronted cabinet against the far wall. And there, on the top shelf, nestled between several technical manuals, was a small blue handbag exactly the shade Lucia had carried everywhere. Reed stepped out, holding Doris's inhaler. Found it on my desk, he said, handing it to her. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the glimpse of blue visible through the closing door. Reed, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. That blue bag in your office. Reed turned, following her gaze. Oh, that old thing? Just an old bag that belonged to my daughter. Not really into girly things, so I kept it here. Would you mind if I took a closer look? Margaret asked, already rising from her chair. Reed shrugged. Sure, I guess. He retrieved the bag and handed it to Margaret. It was exactly the same size and style as the one Lucia had saved her allowance for weeks to buy. A small rectangular handbag with white trim and a simple clasp. Derek opened it, but it was empty. She examined the interior carefully, running her fingers along the lining. Inside, she found a small white ribbon tag sewn into the lining. She squinted at it, then frowned. "There's no manufacturer information on this tag," she said, showing it to Doris. "It looks like something was printed here before, but it's been erased somehow. We'll keep it," Doris announced suddenly, clutching the bag to her chest. "If you're sure it's okay. Like I said, it's just gathering dust here," Reed repeated, gesturing toward the door. "Now, if there's nothing else, I should probably be getting you two back to Austin." As they walked back through the junkyard, Margaret and Doris exchanged glances. Neither spoke until they were seated in the vehicle. "It's Lucia's bag," Doris whispered urgently. "I'm sure of it. The tag has been tampered with to remove the brand." Margaret nodded, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. They decided to visit a local antique shop to confirm the bag's origin. The specialist examined the stitching, the material, the clasp. He frowned at the damaged tag. "This is interesting. The identification tag has been tampered with, seemingly deliberately, to remove whatever identifying information was printed here." He confirmed the bag was an original Mattel product from the 1983 to 1984 Barbie limited edition line. The same year Lucia had received hers. Now they had proof: the bag, the car, the strange description. It was all connected to Reed. As they left the antique shop, Margaret noticed the brake warning light on her dashboard. The car began to shudder and lost power. She pulled over to the side of the road as the engine sputtered and died. Before she could call for a tow, a pickup truck pulled over behind them. Margaret's stomach tightened as she recognized Reed Carraway climbing out of the driver's side. A second man, taller with a heavier build, emerged from the passenger door. "Margaret? Doris? Everything okay?" Reed called, approaching them with a look of concern. "This is my buddy Jason. He's pretty good with cars." Reed offered to call a tow truck and fix the car at the junkyard. But when Margaret changed her mind and asked to be taken to the police station instead, both men exchanged a quick, tense glance. "Taking a shortcut," Reed said, not meeting Margaret's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Less traffic this way." The road grew narrower, the surroundings increasingly rural. Margaret's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Reed's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. "Change of plans," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. Instead of answering, Jason reached under his seat and pulled out a small handgun with a silencer attached. He also produced 2 sets of handcuffs. "Put these on," he ordered, holding them out. "Now." When they hesitated, he suddenly shouted, "Now! Put them on or I'll shoot." With trembling hands, Margaret snapped one end of the cold cuffs around her right wrist, then the other around her left. Beside her, Doris did the same. Jason reached back, roughly checking that the cuffs were secure. Then he produced 2 handkerchiefs, balled them up, and shoved one into Margaret's mouth, then Doris's. He snatched the blue bag from Doris's lap. "That's not yours anymore." Reed's eyes met Margaret's in the rearview mirror, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Be quiet," he said coldly, "or you'll never see another daylight." Reed turned the truck onto a narrow dirt road, trees closing in around them as they left civilization behind. In the fading light, Margaret could make out a dilapidated farmhouse with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Nearby stood a battered camper trailer. Reed parked the truck about 50 yards from the house. With their hands still cuffed and gags in their mouths, the women were helpless as Reed and Jason marched them toward the farmhouse. As they passed the camper trailer, Margaret noticed it was rocking noticeably, as if someone inside was moving violently. Reed nudged Jason, snickering. "Looks like the boss is having his good time in there." They continued to the farmhouse, climbing the creaking steps. Reed pushed open the front door, revealing a dim interior that smelled of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. They were guided through a cluttered living room and down a hallway to an office. A desk with an old computer and telephone sat in one corner, while filing cabinets lined the opposite wall. An older man with graying hair sat in a chair near the window reading a newspaper. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face expressionless. "Watch these two," Reed instructed him as Jason removed the gags. "We're going to get something to eat before the boss is done." Reed produced a length of chain, which he used to secure Margaret and Doris's handcuffs to a heavy metal radiator in the corner. As soon as they were alone with the older man, Margaret began to plead. "Please help us. We haven't done anything wrong." "My daughter is a police detective," Doris added desperately. "She'll find us. If you help us now, they'll go easier on you." The older man remained silent, picking up his newspaper again but not actually reading it. They continued calling out, begging for help, explaining their situation. The older man ignored them. Finally, he approached them with a stern expression. "Be quiet," he hissed harshly, "or they'll hurt you. You don't know what they're capable of." "We're looking for my granddaughter, Lucia Holbrook," Doris said, her voice softer now. "She was only 8 years old when she disappeared with her father 16 years ago. If she's here, please just let us know." The older man studied them with hard eyes. Then he glanced toward the hallway, listening, apparently satisfied they were alone. His face softened almost imperceptibly. "They call her Samantha in here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I knew her name was Lucia, because that's what they called her before they changed it 4 years ago." Margaret gasped, her knees buckling. "She's here. My Lucia is here." The older man nodded curtly. "Keep your voice down." Before he could say more, they heard footsteps. He quickly shoved his phone back into his pocket. 3 men entered the room. Reed, Jason, and a large, muscular man dressed only in a dirty white tank top and boxer shorts. His bare legs were covered in coarse hair, and his arms bore faded tattoos. "What are you doing in here, Micah?" the boss demanded, his voice a deep rasp. The older man, Micah, took a step back. "These women were noisy, brother. I was just telling them to be quiet." The boss studied him suspiciously. "Search him," he ordered Reed and Jason. "If you find anything, deal with him." Reed's face was cold. "Yes, boss." As they were led away, the boss turned his attention to Margaret and Doris. His eyes traveled over their bodies in a revolting manner. "So, Reed tells me you're here for Samantha." He reached out and touched Margaret's hair. "I like older women, too." Margaret jerked away from his touch, her handcuffs rattling. "Give her back to us," she demanded. The boss laughed, a deep, unsettling sound. He turned to Jason. "Bring them in." Jason returned moments later with 3 women. They appeared to be in their mid-20s, all with similar builds and long brown hair. They stood with their heads bowed. The boss announced a cruel game. They had to pick which one was Lucia. If they got it right, he would let them see her. Margaret studied the women desperately. One had a small scar near her right eyebrow. She had gotten that scar falling off her bicycle when she was 6. Margaret raised her cuffed hands and pointed. Her mother pointed to the same woman. The boss's laughter filled the room. "Family really can tell each other apart, can't they?" He gestured to the other 2 women. "Take these 2 away." Now the real nightmare began. The boss forced Lucia to undress. Then he turned his attention to Margaret, unlocking her from the radiator and dragging her to the center of the room. "I like older women, too," he repeated, running a thick finger down Margaret's cheek. "Samantha, strip her for me."
"No," Margaret gasped.
"Lucia, I'm your mother. Please." Lucia hesitated, something flickering in her eyes, but her face remained expressionless as she took a step forward. Suddenly, the door burst open. Reed rushed in, his face pale. "Boss, police are outside." The boss froze, his expression shifting from lustful to furious. "How the hell did they find us?" Reed's voice was tight with fear. "They've surrounded the place." Enraged, the boss grabbed the gun from Reed's waistband. "Then I'll do it myself," he snarled, aiming the weapon at Margaret. Before he could pull the trigger, Micah burst through the doorway and leapt in front of Margaret. 2 shots rang out in quick succession. Micah crumpled to the floor, blood spreading across his shirt. The boss tried to fire again, but the gun clicked empty. "Damn it!" he roared, tossing the weapon aside. Then the world exploded. The front door splintered inward. "Police, drop your weapons." Armed officers flooded the room. Jason immediately raised his hands in surrender, as did Reed. The boss lunged toward an officer. A shot rang out, striking his thigh. Instead of falling, he laughed. Another officer fired, hitting his shoulder. This time, he fell to his knees, his face contorted with pain. As officers secured the scene, Margaret went to Lucia. "Lucia, it's me. It's Mom." There was no response, only empty eyes. The paramedics arrived. Doris was examined. Micah was rushed into surgery, and Lucia remained silent, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. At the hospital, Detective Reyes explained the horrifying truth. The boss was Charlie Carnes, a wanted serial killer who had been evading capture for decades. He had been drifting from place to place, and 16 years ago, he and his young accomplice, Reed, had encountered Jim Holbrook and Lucia on the road. They pretended to be hitchhikers. Jim, ever kind, helped them. That night, Charlie drugged Jim's drink. He strangled him in the motel bathroom. Reed helped dispose of the body in a sinkhole. Charlie took Lucia, renaming her Samantha. He kept her hidden for 16 years. Margaret sat in stunned silence. Her husband had been murdered that very first night. Her daughter had endured 16 years of captivity and abuse. But then she went to Lucia's room. She took her daughter's hand. "Lucia, it's Mom." For a long time, nothing. Then, finally, a whisper. "I'm so sorry for being so broken," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. "It's not your fault, sweetheart. None of this was your fault. We're together now. That's all that matters." "I miss Daddy," Lucia said, a single tear sliding down her cheek. Margaret stroked her daughter's hair. "I know, sweetheart. I miss him, too." The road to healing would be long and difficult. But after 16 years of searching, of hoping against hope, Margaret had found her daughter. The crushed Cadillac, the tampered handbag, the desperate gamble, they had all led her home. And as she watched her daughter finally close her eyes to sleep, safe for the first time in 16 years, Margaret whispered a silent thank you. They were together, and that was all that mattered.